Welcome everybody to the 33rd anniversary of the Hans Fischer Lectureship. I'm Josh Miller. In case you don't know, I'm Professor and Chair of the Department of Nutritional Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all today. To move things along, I'm going to hand off for a message of welcome to our Executive Dean, Laura Lawson.
All right. We were just talking about how even though many of you teach, you all sat in the back of the room, which is pretty funny. So feel free to come forward. It never works when you ask that in class, but I just want to put that out there. So it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 2024 Hans Fischer Lecture. The Hans Fischer Lecture is an essential moment in our school's academic year, part of the history and commitment to being in a unique place of learning and connection. And I hear Hans is in Zoom land, and so it is a pleasure, Hans, to have you here. We do this to celebrate over 50 years that he served as a faculty member and in many important leadership roles. So providing welcomes at lectureships is a special treat to me because it's an opportunity, particularly here for the Hans Fischer and Nutritional Sciences, to be part of this community. It's a really wonderful tradition that's around a shared interest of learning new things. And when I look back, every time I like to look back at the past lectures, it's like a departmental diary and a glimpse into your discipline. We're here today to welcome Dr. Micheal Jensen as our speaker. Dr. Jensen comes from Rochester, and I was hoping it was going to be better weather for you. Got a little warmer today, so and we probably have a few more trees in bloom. That's my line of work. So yeah, we did that for you. And I'm very delighted to have you here today and to speak on such an important matter. While I am not a nutritional scientist, my mother was a dietitian, but the work that you do is relevant to all of our lives. And so thank you very much for coming and sharing it. I also want to take this chance to welcome our guests. And also to thank the faculty, staff, and students in the Department of Nutritional Sciences for their dedication and commitment to this event. Life is demanding. Right now is really demanding. Our students are just a week away from classes ending and exams happening and papers due. Our faculty and TAs are like, oh my goodness, then there's all those things to grade and get those grades done. We have graduation, we have Rutgers Ag Field Day, we have all sorts of activities going underway, but you're here, and you're here to be as a community learning new things together. And I just want to thank you for taking time out of busy days to do this. So Nutritional Sciences epitomizes the model we aim for, a department that addresses health and wellness from basic science to applied, and reaches out across disciplines to expand opportunities and engages with community to address on-the-ground nutrition and health realities facing our communities both locally and globally. So thank you for sharing this event. Thank you for making it accessible to so many people either here or through Zoom. And thank you for coming for our lecture today.
All right, thank you, Dean Lawson. I forgot to advance the slide. So
That's fine.
All right. So next, I want to introduce to you the lectureship honoree, Dr. Hans Fischer, who's joining us via Zoom. Before I turn it over to him to give a couple of comments, in recent years, I've been trying to see connections between what Dr. Fischer's research, what he did research-wise in his career, to the speaker. Wasn't any clear connections, but I went back into the old literature from 1957, Journal of Nutrition. This is a paper by Hans and Dr. Gil Lavelle on observations on cholesterol, linoleic acid, linoleic and linoleic acid content of eggs as influenced by dietary fats. So the connection, dietary fats, I guess, to the today's lecture. So with saying that, Hans, are you ready to give us some remarks?
Anyway, I want to thank all of you. I wanted to make one interesting comment. This lectureship got started in 1991 by Dr. John Sati from the University of Wisconsin, who was an expert on blood clotting, and he was the chairman of a committee that was brought in to review the doings of this nutritional sciences department. And he and the other members of his committee decided afterwards that it was a pretty good department, but it might benefit from getting very good lecturers every once in a while. And they thought that I might also benefit from being honored for having brought it to that stage. The department started in 1966 when the president of Rutgers, a man by the name of Mason Gross, gave a lecture to the American Dietetic Association in Philadelphia. No one had any idea that he was going to make that comment. And he gave this lecture and said that Rutgers is going to start a Department of Nutritional Sciences. And the dean at the time was furious at me. He said I had gone to the president and talked him into it. I had never spoken to the president. I was afraid to talk to the president. And anyway, for a couple of years, I was bad man out as far as his dean is concerned. And after that, he relaxed and the department was permitted to grow. So I just thought some of you might be interested in that information. But in any case, many, many thanks to Dr. Jensen. I've also always been interested in fatty acid metabolism. Fiber is big on my list today, and above all, exercise. Food alone won't do it. Exercise in combination with a good diet hopefully will let you get to a ripe old age. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Dr. Jensen, for a most enlightening lecture.
All right. First of all, before we get to our speaker, I want to make some acknowledgments because when we leave them to the end, we forget. So, as always, we thank Christina Duffy for arranging everything. And I want to thank our seminar committee, Harini Sampath Chair, Malcolm Watford, Sue Shapsis, and Joe Dixon. And now I want to introduce Harini Sampath, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you everybody for being here today. Good afternoon. It's truly my pleasure and honor to introduce our Hans Fischer 2024 speaker, Dr. Micheal Jensen. So Dr. Jensen is actually the Thomas J. Watson Jr. Professor in honor of Dr. Robert L. Frye. I had to read that, at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. So let me tell you a little bit about Mike. Mike originally hails from Missouri, which is where he did all his early education, obtaining his bachelor's degree in biology and also his real doctor's degree, his MD, both from the University of Missouri in Kansas City. And then following a short residency in Missouri, he then moved to Rochester, Minnesota, to the Mayo Clinic, and he must love the cold because he has been there ever since, moving on up through the ranks. Up to this point where he's now a named professor in endocrinology, nutrition, and internal medicine at the Mayo. Dr. Jensen's illustrious career, of course, includes numerous awards and honors that really underscore his commitment to medical science and medical education. Of course, I cannot highlight all the awards that he has won, but I would like to point out that he has won numerous awards from the preeminent professional organizations or institutions in obesity and nutrition, such as the American Society for Nutrition, which has decorated him numerous times, including most recently giving him the 2023 George Bray Outstanding Scientific Achievements in Obesity Research Award, the American Society for Clinical Nutrition, which gave him the Robert H. Herman Memorial Award, and the Obesity Society, which thinks that Dr. Jensen is tops because they gave him the TOPS Research Achievement Award in 2010. So these are, of course, just a small fraction of the numerous distinctions that his work has rightly earned him. Mike has also consistently provided critical service to our fields of obesity and nutrition, having served on numerous study sections for the NIH, on the board of directors for organizations such as the American Society for Nutrition, as well as the National Board of Physician Nutrition Specialists. And he also serves on the editorial boards of many of the prestigious journals that we all publish in, including journals such as the American Journal of Physiology, Endocrinology and Metabolism, the journal Diabetes, and of course currently serving as the editor-in-chief of the journal Obesity. I'd like to just take a moment to say a few words about his scholarship, of which I'm an avid fan. Dr. Jensen has been a leader, a pioneer, really, in the study of adipose tissue biology, both in the deposition as well as the mobilization of lipid from various adipose depots. He has pioneered the use of isotope tracer methods as well as LC-MS techniques to really study free fatty acid trafficking under both physiological as well as pathological conditions, getting fundamental insights into fatty acid flux in healthy and obese individuals. I was looking through some of his scholarship, and I noticed that one of his early articles was a letter to the editor of New England Journal of Medicine, and it was titled, Relation Between Chubby Cheeks and Visceral Fat, wherein he and his colleagues posited that the appearance of buccal fat, or chubby cheeks, if you will, is associated with upper body visceral obesity, and that correlated with much worse metabolic pathologies than overall obesity per se. So I'd like to highlight that paper, not just because of the brilliantly enticing title, but also because I think it's very much related to his talk today, which will be delving into the mechanisms of body fat distribution and relationship to human health. On a personal note, I will say, Dr. Jensen has been invited to speak at very numerous institutions and prestigious lectureships, but this is his first visit to Rutgers, so thank you for coming here. But he does share that he felt a connection to Rutgers before he even came here because he's from Kansas City and therefore a fan of the Chiefs. And apparently one of the running backs, Isaiah Pacheco, for the Chiefs was formerly a Scarlet Knight. So there's a little bit of trivia for you. Of course, I shared this information at the dinner table with my family yesterday, and think my daughter would be more impressed if you were best friends with Travis Kelce, so we could get Taylor Swift tickets. Yes. But all that notwithstanding, I really would like to say what a genuine pleasure it is to have you here. It's been wonderful talking to you through the last couple of days, and we're so happy that you were able to accept this invitation and look forward to hearing your insights. Welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Travis Kelce and I go way back. Oh, okay. Well, you already got my my title. It's kind of unusual because it's not the Thomas J. Watson Jr. Professorship. It's the Thomas J. Watson Jr. Professorship. So I'm not a junior professor. So Mayo always makes me put in these disclosure slides that says I'm not gonna tell you guys about things that I consult with. So I have done some consulting for Biohaven Pharmaceuticals. So when I went on the faculty in 1985, one of the first places they put me was in our nutrition obesity clinic. And within about 2 weeks of each other, I saw these two women who came to see me about their weight problems. And the lady on your right had 50% body fat, diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, all the complications. And the woman on your left had 50% body fat and was completely healthy metabolically. And this was about the time that some of the work had been coming out about body fat distribution and how it was related to metabolic health. And I thought, well, there's got to be something different about these different fat depots and how they're behaving. And we had just developed a method for measuring free fatty acid kinetics using intravenous administration of tracers. And I thought, well, maybe there's something about the release of fatty acids from adipose tissue that might be different about these two different kinds of obesity. And it turns out we did our first studies, and there was. So that kind of got me hooked into this issue of fatty acid metabolism and obesity. But, not everybody thinks about adipose tissue all day long like I do. So I thought I'd kind of take a step back and say, well, what is the main function of adipose tissue? Adipose tissue is our energy bank. It's much denser than any other form of energy we have in our body. And so it's a very, very nice way to carry around some extra calories. And when I mean extra calories, what am I talking about? So if this is 1 week's of food, so if you could get a grocery cart full of food, and that would be enough to tide you through for a week. So that's a pretty big volume. You got to admit, a whole grocery cart. The average lean man or woman carries around about this many calories in their adipose tissue, about 3 months worth of food. So you could go about 3 months without eating a calorie before you've depleted all of your adipose tissue stores if you're normal weight. So you got to admit, it's much easier carrying around a normal amount of body fat than 12 carts of groceries. And that's how efficient adipose tissue is. So it's really quite remarkable. We wouldn't be mobile without it. So my interest then is adipose tissue fat balance. And so we are very good at storing fat in adipose tissue. And if you consume 100 grams of fat a day, some of that's going to get stored in adipose tissue, some is going to be burned. And if we're in fat balance, you're going to burn 100 grams of fat a day. And adipose tissue is a really important player in that and determining, keeping blood fat levels stable to provide energy when you need it and to not provide energy when you don't need it. And one of the more important regulatory things about adipose tissue is its ability to shut down lipolysis when you don't need it. So when we wake up in the morning, adipose tissue is doing a really good job of matching the fuel that we need with the fuel that it delivers. So adipose tissue seems to be pretty tightly tuned to sensing our energy needs, and it releases fatty acids proportional to metabolic rate. So people with high metabolic rate are releasing more fatty acids no matter how much or little fat they've got, and small people are releasing less at the lower metabolic rate. So when you wake up in the morning, things are in very nice balance. And then if you go and have a glass of orange juice and you get a nice slug of insulin, within about 30 to 60 minutes, you can suppress the release of fatty acids from fat cells by 90+%. And this is important for two reasons. One is that the reduction in fatty acids allows insulin to do its job better. So your muscle is better able to take up glucose. And it also presumably permits greater storage of nutrients in adipose tissue. So let's get back to the energy balance side of things to put those grocery carts in another perspective. So if this is adipose tissue in a lean, healthy guy, this healthy guy, his bank account is delivering $1 an hour and to stay in good metabolic health on average over 24 hours. So his bank account is about $2 million. So $1 an hour, healthy delivery, you got $2 million in the bank. So that's a relationship between what you're spending and what you've got in savings. Women have more body fat than men, but their they have a healthy release rate, and let's call that healthy release rate to stay in metabolic health $1 an hour. The average woman has $3.4 million in her savings account, and it's delivering $1 an hour. And it's very, very tightly regulated. So it's so tightly regulated that if you get up to $1.40 an hour of delivery, you've got insulin resistance, hyperlipidemia, and you're at risk for diabetes. And so if you have an obese guy who is developing these things and he's delivering $1.40 an hour from his bank account, in the average guy with a BMI 35 has got $4 million in his savings account for $1.40 an hour. And for women with obesity, 50% body fat at a BMI of 35, which is pretty average, at metabolic risk, they're also delivering $1.40 an hour from savings account. But our women who participate in our studies have the equivalent of $6.7 million in their savings account. And they can only deliver $1.40 an hour. So when we're talking about getting that account down to $2 million or $3 million, you can see how much money you have to spend without making any deposits in order to materially reduce that bank account. So when we think about getting people to reduce body fat stores, that's spending a lot of money without making any deposits. So it's not easy to do. And so this is sort of some normal metabolic flexibility. So when a lean, healthy person, when they have a meal in the morning, glucose goes up, insulin goes up, free fatty acids drop like a rock. They're released from adipose tissue. Glucose starts going down, insulin goes down, fatty acids go back. So this is a case where you can have high insulin, high glucose, and low free fatty acids. The body's happy with that. What we see in upper body obesity is glucose goes up, insulin goes way up, but fatty acids don't go down. They don't go down enough for it to get this kind of nice dip. And this is a case where we have high insulin, high glucose, and high free fatty acids. So you've got total nutrient overload. Do that often enough, and the body doesn't like it. You end up with this so-called lipotoxicity. The extreme next example of that would be, say, in fasting. So when you start fasting, glucose goes down, insulin drops a lot, fatty acids go up for the first 30 hours or so and then plateau, and then ketone bodies start getting made and they go up and up and up and up. So this is the reverse of the meal. So in this case, you've got low insulin, low glucose, and high FFA. And the body functions just perfectly well under those conditions too. So 2 lows and a high works okay. 3 highs doesn't work okay. And so we're interested in the conditions where we get high insulin, high glucose, high FFA as this lipotoxic combination. And the first time this kind of hit us is one of my fellows, Lori Roust, was doing a study where we fed just a meal to women with, with upper body obesity, with lower body obesity, or women who were not obese. And the lower body obese women here had a suppression that was almost the same as our lean women, whereas the upper body obese did not suppress well. So that at this nadir, at the low point of the delivery of fatty acids into the bloodstream, upper body obese women were about 3 times as high as lean women. And the reason I do look at nadir is because in subsequent studies, we looked at what are the various parameters of postprandial fatty acid metabolism that seem to relate best to health. And for some reason, statistically, the nadir you hit is the best predictor of hypertriglyceridemia, insulin resistance, and things like that. Not the area under the curve or any of those things. I don't know why, but statistically, the nadir was the most important. And so the concept that we've been trying to explore is that in upper body obesity, there's an insulin resistance primarily in adipose tissue, and that this results in elevated free fatty acids. And then if you have elevated fatty acids, you can have muscle insulin resistance. And we know that because if we take lean, healthy people and raise their FFA for 3 or 4 hours, you can make them insulin resistant.
There's also been some studies that suggest that if you raise FFA, you can make your vasculature more sensitive to vasoconstrictive stimuli and less responsive to vasodilatory stimuli, which could be a link between blood pressure control and obesity. If you raise FFA in lean people, you can make it more difficult for the insulin to suppress glucose production. And if you raise FFA and glucose, the pancreas will secrete more insulin. So there's some potential ways that excess FFA coming from adipose tissue in central or upper body obesity could be contributing to many of the metabolic abnormalities that we see. And about the time we were getting started with our studies, it was pointed out that one of the best predictors of all these metabolic consequences was visceral fat. And so this would be a CT slice of the abdomen in somebody with lower body obesity where most of their adipose tissue is subcutaneous and they don't have much visceral fat. And here's a CT slice from somebody who has an equal amount of visceral and subcutaneous fat. And so our hypothesis was, since visceral fat is the best predictor of a lot of these metabolic complications, that these excess free fatty acids that we were seeing must be coming from visceral fat. And certainly if you take intra-abdominal fat cells and put them in a petri dish and measure fatty lipolysis, it's higher in these omental and mesenteric adipocytes. So it made sense. So how are we going to test that? Well, we collaborated with our colleagues in interventional radiology, and after measuring upper body subcutaneous fat, visceral fat, and leg fat, we were able to have our radiology colleagues put in catheters in the femoral artery, femoral vein, and hepatic vein, and then we could measure leg and splanchnic plasma flow, and then we could do fatty acid tracers so we could look at uptake and release of fatty acids across the leg, uptake and release across the splanchnic bed, and then everything that's left over was coming from upper body subcutaneous fat. So how do you measure how sensitive adipose tissue is to insulin? This is one of the things we wanted to do when we started these studies. And fatty acids are released as uniquely sensitive to insulin, such that tiny increases in insulin result in major suppression, and then as you raise insulin further, you get a little bit more suppression. And it's one of the systems in the body that, like other systems, like the pH system, seems to operate on a log scale. So if we could log transform our release rates and log transform insulin, you end up getting really nice linear relationships between insulin and lipolysis. And the nice thing about that is you can then use a pharmacologic approach to measure insulin sensitivity as the insulin concentration resulting in a 50% suppression. And I'd been familiar with this since med school pharmacology, but I wondered, does it play out in physiology? And it turns out that this IC50 that we can measure using insulin infusion techniques is a good predictor of plasma triglyceride concentrations and a good predictor of glucose insulin sensitivity. And it's very reproducible. If you do it even 4 months apart in the same person, you get very close to the same answer. So it's much more reproducible than some of the other ways we have of measuring insulin action. So I'm really excited to show this because we just got this paper accepted a little bit ago. We were looking at the insulin regulation of regional fatty acid release. So we recruited some volunteers with upper body obesity and some volunteers with non-obese state to undergo measures of fatty acid metabolism under fasting, low dose and high dose insulin concentrations. So these are the fatty acid concentrations in our 3 groups, men and women, under the 3 different conditions, and the insulin concentrations under the different conditions. And we were able to generate those IC50 curves that I showed you, where we look at the plasma insulin concentrations versus the release rates, and you get very nice linear relationships between the palmitate release and insulin. And so for each of the different depots, total body, leg, and upper body subcutaneous, you can calculate the IC50 for each depose separately. So we were trying to understand which of the depots of the body is contributing most of the fatty acids, and are they differentially insulin resistant? And what you can kind of see here is that the dark symbols are the data from our volunteers with obesity, and the light symbols are from our lean volunteers. And in all the cases, the people who are lean are below those who are obese. So at any given insulin concentration, we have higher release of fatty acids. And it turns out it was not specific to any single depot. However, the vast majority, way over 50% of the fatty acids, were coming from this upper body subcutaneous depot, which was, we'd seen that before, but this was a cleaner test of that hypothesis. And when we've studied women with lower body obesity, so that's this group here, they virtually overlap lean women in terms of their insulin responsiveness. And women with upper body obesity are upshifted and to the right, so they're way more insulin resistant. But that sort of begs the question about, I'll skip this, about why they're insulin resistant. So take home from here is insulin is a major regulator of adipose tissue lipolysis, that in our experience, upper body obesity, especially if there's a lot of visceral fat, it's virtually synonymous with dysregulation of insulin-mediated suppression of lipolysis. But that, to our surprise, it's the subcutaneous adipose tissue that accounts for the majority of fatty acid storage and release, even in people with a lot of visceral fat. So upper body subcutaneous fat accounts for the majority of the subcutaneous fat release. To circle back, the insulin concentration resulting in a 50% suppression of FFA release is a pretty good index of adipose insulin resistance. But we still were trying to puzzle out what is it about upper body obesity that causes that insulin resistance. So our first thought, just like everybody, you go straight to insulin signaling, right? Must be insulin signaling. Everything is insulin signaling. But you think about it, you could have normal insulin signaling, but if the proteins that are that end product of lipolysis, the lipases, if they're not responding because of a defect in the protein, you could have normal insulin signaling all the way down and still be seen to be insulin resistant. And we started thinking about what could cause the development of these abnormalities in the context of upper body obesity. And I jumped on the inflammation bandwagon pretty hard. It had a seatbelt and everything. It was first reported in the late 1990s that there was inflammation in adipose tissue. It was initially proposed to mediate systemic inflammation. And in subcutaneous adipose tissue, there's a sterile inflammation, and it appears to be more prominent in people with visceral obesity. And there was a lot of literature about cytokine production by these inflammatory cells. And so there was a pretty good story to be made that these inflammatory cells were making cytokines that were adversely affecting fat cells. And here's the theory that we know we have monocytes that get into adipose tissue. They can either be classically activated or M1 that we know make inflammatory cytokines and other things that promote inflammation. They can be alternatively activated to be more anti-inflammatory and more wound repair and fibrosis. And so we were pretty sure that it would be something about the inflammatory characteristics of adipose tissue that was different between these different kinds of obesity and between lean that was causing a local dysfunction of fat cells. And so we tried to set up a variety of ways to measure inflammation. We used immunohistochemistry to identify the so-called anti-inflammatory and pro-inflammatory macrophages using accepted, although admittedly imperfect markers, and then total macrophages. And because I work closely with my friend Jim Kirkland, who's really interested in cellular senescence, we also measured senescent cells, and this is a beta-galactosidase stain. And Jim's interest has been in once the cells become senescent, so they can't differentiate, they can't proliferate, they become very inflammatory. And so it could be that you have senescent cells with chemokines that bring in macrophages that create TNF, IL-6, IL-1 beta, and there was a lot of papers showing that these can decrease insulin signaling or cause other problems in adipocytes. And so under conditions of high catecholamines, we have a cascade through adenylate cyclase that activates lipolysis, and then if insulin comes along, it activates AKT, which activates a phosphodiesterase that breaks down cyclic AMP and inhibits lipolysis. So insulin resistance, we naturally figured we're going to measure this phosphorylation of AKT in response to insulin as a way to look at whether impaired insulin signaling is related to insulin resistance. And then also going to look at inflammatory things like IL-6 and macrophages, senescent cells, to see if there's a role there. So we measure adipose inflammation by immunohistochemistry, senescent cells, mRNA for inflammatory markers, and then senescent cells by another measure. So we looked this at different fat distributions range from lean to obese, men and women. And our hypothesis was this increased risk of chronic disease and inflammation would reflect in adipose tissue, which would be reduced insulin signaling and insulin resistance at the fatty acid level. And circle back to this, it would tie all of our ideas together. We could explain it all by inflammation. Well, so here's our AKT phosphorylation data. So we had a bunch of people, did an adipose tissue biopsy, gave them insulin, did another adipose tissue biopsy, looked at how insulin sensitive they were at the whole body level, and then looked at how much AKT phosphorylation they had in response to insulin, and there was nothing. There was no relationship between the ability of insulin to phosphorylate AKT and its ability to suppress FFA. So first boat shot out of the water. We were wrong on that. So we thought maybe it could be another mechanism. So maybe AKT isn't it, but surely inflammation is affecting something that's making the tissue insulin resistant. So we stepped back from the AKT and said, well, let's just look at inflammation in general and see if that's related to insulin resistance. And so if we look at the total macrophage content and its relationship to insulin resistance, this is the IC50 I told you about, there was nothing. But we hadn't lost heart because total macrophages could be pro and anti-inflammatory. So we looked at specifically the pro-inflammatory macrophage marker CD14, and if anything, there was even less of a relationship between inflammation and insulin resistance. Then Jim Kirkland says you got to look at senescent cells. Senescent cells, if anything, is even less related to insulin resistance than all the other things we looked at. And it didn't relate to mRNA expression for IL-6 or anything else that we looked at. So the inflammatory cell content of adipose tissue didn't correlate with our insulin regulation at all. So is there a predictor of adipose insulin resistance as measured by this ability to suppress FFA release? And it circled back to something we've been measuring since the 1980s, fat cell size. So abdominal fat cell size was the best predictor we could find of the reduced ability of insulin to suppress FFA release. And it's not like there's a break point here, right? It's not like it's fine, and then it goes up. There's almost a linear relationship that I have no way to explain. We've done a bunch of other studies with other proteins, hormone-sensitive lipase, perilipin, everything else, and we don't yet quite understand what it is about the size of the fat cell that makes it harder to suppress FFA release. So we've done some interventions as part of the inflammation story. We gave people high-dose omega-3s for 6 months because that's supposed to reduce inflammation, didn't improve inflammation or IC50. We had people lose weight with a lifestyle intervention, lost 10% of their body weight. Nice improvement in insulin resistance, but no change in adipose inflammation from any measure we could make. So the best predictor of insulin resistance with regards to the FFA release part of it that we could find thus far has been fat cell size. And to our surprise, none of the measures of inflammation that we have been able to do were predictive of insulin resistance after you control for fat cell size. And also the classic insulin signaling pathway doesn't appear statistically related to insulin resistance. Now, that's not to say that there's not more macrophages. There's not macrophages and dead fat cells and everything else in adipose tissue. There are. There's plenty of immune cells in adipose tissue, and you can actually see macrophages sort of eating around the edge of dead fat cells. But my analogy is they're not the murderer, they're the coroner. So maybe they weren't there making things go wrong. They were there cleaning up after the mess. So maybe that's what we're seeing when we see all these macrophages in human adipose tissue, is they're the trash collectors. They're cleaning up after the mess has been made. So adipose tissue insulin resistance does result in inappropriately elevated postprandial and fasting FFA, but the cellular mechanisms on how this develops are not clear, and thankfully we've still got a lot of experiments to do to try to tease this out, so if I ever come back, maybe I'll have the answer for you. But I hope this has been a little stimulating, because we were certainly convinced going in that we were going to be a big adipose inflammation lab, and we were going to solve all of our problems, and we could develop anti-inflammatory treatments. And now we're having to go a completely different direction to try to understand adipose insulin resistance. The hope being that if we understand why some people's adipose tissue stays insulin sensitive when they gain weight, you can look at that from a mechanistic standpoint and say, okay, if we can't get people to lose weight, could we at least make their adipose more insulin sensitive so their metabolic dysfunction goes away? So that's what we'd like to do. If I was really smart, I'd figure out how to get people to lose weight and keep it off. But I'm going for second base instead of home run. So I'd like to thank all my collaborators, especially those who helped me learn about inflammation on the left side, and all the fellows, and especially Dr. Kelly Lytle, who's a junior faculty who works with me, has just been fantastic at putting all of our studies together and keeping the fellows in line and challenging me to keep learning. So happy to answer any questions.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes? So may I offer my thanks to Dr. Jensen for a fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
So we have for you a plaque commemorating your lecture. It's in recognition of the Hans Fischer Lectureship, Adipose Tissue Inflammation, Lipolysis, and Body Fat Distribution, Relationship to Human Health, given by Dr. Micheal Jensen on this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
There you go. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming.